Welcome to FS-ISAC's podcast, Fin Cyber Today. I'm Elizabeth Heathfield, Chief Communications Officer at FS-ISAC. Today's guest is Dr. Boaz Gelbord, the Chief Security Officer at Akamai Technologies, which is one of the world's largest tech companies and a key provider of services to the financial sector. Boaz has a long history in financial services, serving as CISO of Dun & Bradstreet as well as at Bloomberg. But in his current role, he has his finger on the pulse of the security of the entire internet at large. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Thanks for being here, Boaz.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Cool. So let's start with, what is it like to be a CISO now? You've been a CISO for quite a while. What is it like to be a CISO now versus 2-3 years ago? What's changed?
I guess I've been a CISO for a lot more than 2-3 years at this point, and there's been change throughout. I think the biggest thing is just it's become so much more complex and really more exciting and interesting. When I first started doing this, less of the world was interconnected, and I think the stakes in some ways, even though they were high, they weren't quite as high as they are today. So, I think today just every company is so interconnected, and cyber is such a fundamental part of their risk profile that there's never really a dull moment. And the CISO is really integrated into every aspect of the business risk decisioning. And so it's a great time to be a CISO. I feel very fortunate to have fallen into this field.
What skill sets do you think that you need now? And what are the ones that you see as the role evolves? What do you think the new skill sets are that a CISO is going to need to have?
Well, I think that the core skill sets have really remained the same over time, which is a combination of both a organizational knowledge of how do organizations work and how do you drive change within organizations, how do you build bridges within organizations, combined with a deep appreciation for technology and a deep understanding of technology, and sort of a desire and interest in figuring out what are the different ways that organizational processes can be subverted and ways that you can sort of subvert the security model of an organization. Like a lot of CISOs, I started out in technology. I started out kind of deep in technical systems and trying to understand, how do you secure cell phones from attack? How do you secure mobile networks, in my case, from attack? And then at some point kind of made the transition to how do you secure an organization as a whole? And in many ways, I found that process of looking at, either a specific technology versus an organization in some ways involves those same skills. So I think that core skill set has remained the same. The one thing that I think has changed a lot is that because security and cybersecurity in general has become so interwoven into just a lot of overall issues in terms of society and how economy runs, and you see things around whether it's disinformation or now things around AI and quantum computing and et cetera. You really, as a CISO, need to have the full breadth. You have to keep abreast of a very, very wide breadth of technologies. And again, that's one of the things I find very compelling in the role.
Do you think that CISOs now need to have more business skills or more of a sense of business than they might have before? Or do you think that's actually something that's actually always been a part of the core CISO skill set?
I think in some ways it's always been part of a core CISO skill set. I think what has changed is that over recent years, more companies have sort of business-oriented CISOs. So if you look, let's say 5 years back, I think a lot of folks who had a CISO role or a CISO title were really just leading a security technology function, which again is a very critical thing to do and is important to have. And for some organizations, particularly at that time, was sufficient. But what I think you see today is that there's a greater proportion of folks who carry that title are really in a business-facing role. So I would say that for most people today who are CISOs, it is a more important skill set to have than it was in the past.
You've been a CISO at private companies, public companies. What's different between those? Is there a difference? I would imagine that, because of the regulatory requirements and investor reporting requirements, there is some kind of difference. But what are the differences that you find between being a CISO at a public versus private company?
I think it used to be the case that public companies kind of had a head start in some ways because they had a lot of these requirements, for example, in the United States, SOX reporting requirements, which had cyber elements to them. So as a public company, you had a certain level of kind of cyber hygiene, which you had to adhere to, which maybe as a private company, you didn't have. Today, I think there's probably less of a difference because a lot of the expectations in terms of a cybersecurity program, a lot of the risk management that companies are looking to do comes from just overall customer requirements or regulatory requirements, which aren't really particular to either public or private companies. So if you think of, for example, a lot of breach notification requirements and things like that, which don't necessarily distinguish between those two types of entities. So I think today that there's, in some ways, private companies have caught up. Certainly customer expectations don't distinguish between whether their vendor is public or is private. You certainly have certain industries where the regulations are such that they drive a lot of the cybersecurity programs. What I see as one of the biggest challenge for CISOs, whether it's in a private company or in a public company that has those kind of reporting expectations in some of those regulatory environments, is to ensure that you're efficiently aligning your technical security program with your compliance programs. And that's certainly for folks who were involved in some of the public company requirements in the early days. That was one of the challenges where you'd have the things that were being required from you because you were a public company versus the things that you felt needed to be done from a pure security risk perspective. And oftentimes there wasn't a strong alignment between that. And particularly in kind of larger, more complex organizations, if you let that divide grow too wide, that can be a source of a lot of inefficiencies and a lot of opportunity costs, because there's things that you really should be doing to secure your environment, but that you're sort of diverting those resources to compliance requirements instead. So I think for both private and public companies, one of the key challenges is really building in that alignment. And companies have various ways to do that. Certainly through automation, through making sure that you have the right tool sets in place, but also a lot of it is around the narrative that you have to your own customers, the narrative to regulators, right? And to be part of that discussion in terms of bringing forth the position of what should regulations look like, and how do you make sure that those things, the spirit of what is intended is the same as what's actually being put forth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've also been CISO at financial firms and now tech companies. Obviously, finance, it's where the money is, but do you see differences in, overall structure, overall strategy, and then, down the line down to more kind of granular differences between how financial companies view their security function versus tech companies, or not really?
I think this is another area where in the past there may have been greater divergences than there are today. Today almost any company is at the end of the day a tech company, right? Their company is powered by technology, and technology is fundamental to the delivery of their services. So I think that the core security program, and if you look at how do you structure a security program, what are the defenses you have to have in place, the people, process, and technology, there's a great deal of similarities across industries, whether it's financial or non-financial industry. And in many ways, that didn't necessarily exist as much in the past. That's why you see some of these common frameworks put forward by NIST and other organizations internationally, which really look, can apply not in a pure cookie cutter sense, but can apply in broad strokes across organizations. You do find that, for example, financial industry has its own threat landscape, and certainly when you get down to some of the business processes and how those interactions happen, for example, some of the entities that do clearing and how funds are transferred and all that sort of thing. Certainly, there's specifics there that need to be taken into account. But I would say that broadly speaking, the base and the foundation is similar across the board. Now, that being said, I think one of the things that you're seeing is that threat actors are increasingly looking to exploit particular systems that serve certain industries. And so, we have, whichever industry you might choose, if you take the financial industry, for example, there's backbone providers, and there are certain types of software and SaaS and so forth that are particular to that industry. And sometimes there's a specific system that really hasn't gotten a lot of attention, even within that industry, that forms a kind of a soft underbelly for it. And I think that that's an increasing trend that we'll see. We saw recently in the case of airline aviation, there was a couple of weeks back, there was an outage. It wasn't, it didn't seem to be cyber related, but there was an outage that occurred because a back end system that provides notifications was down, and that kind of grounded domestic travel in the United States for a period of time. And I think that those are the kind of dependencies that we haven't really put as much attention to maybe as we have in the past. So kind of going back to your question in terms of the differences by industries, I think there are particular industries which will have those type of systems that need to be more focused on as we go forward.
Mm. That's part of the reason why, you guys work with us on the Critical Provider Program, right? Is to ensure that these critical backbone providers to the financial system, are communicating, and that we're in constant contact, and that, we have these channels that are open, because, we know that the threat actors are going after, suppliers and third parties. Let's talk a little bit about you guys publish a State of the Internet report, the SOTI report, I've heard it's been called. I think it's quite interesting to talk a little bit about like what Akamai's unique vantage point is on the internet, and then what is the state of the internet from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Akamai in many ways, we've been there since the beginning, since the late 90s. We introduced the concept of a CDN, and then we were, came out with a WAF in 2009 and pioneered the web application space. And one of the things I think really differentiates Akamai and that really attracted me to the company is it's very much an engineering-led organization. Our CEO and co-founder, Tom Layton, is a mathematics professor at MIT. And that spirit of engineering and innovation really permeates the organization. And it drives, our thinking in terms of how do we address technology challenges at planetary scale, whether that was in the early days around CDN, today, and then into WAF, and now we're in the cloud space, in the cloud computing space. So that's one of the things I think that that really informs our perspective. And then the other piece is just the size and scale of Akamai. So depending how you measure it, we carry a really significant portion of web traffic. And certainly when you look at sort of the top major banks or the major e-commerce sites and so forth. And in many ways, security is becoming a big data problem, where you look at how do you get that vantage point where you're able to see a significant portion of the internet, and where you're able to detect and differentiate, distinguish between malicious sites, distinguish between malicious attempts and so forth. So I think Akamai is very well positioned for that. And, part of our mission is, enabling the internet for billions of users, billions of times a day. And we take that really to heart in terms of how do we make the ecosystem a better place, and how do we contribute to the internet community writ large. The State of the Internet is one of those reports, as you alluded to, that we're, that we publish. And one of the things that I think in terms of just the way that we see the internet ecosystem evolving is it's getting a lot more complex, and threats are getting more complex. And, there's been a lot of talk of OpenAI and the ChatGPT platform, and how, for example, artificial intelligence is being used and can be leveraged now to subvert a lot of the security protocols that would have been in place in the past. So, I think we are entering a time period that is probably more complex and vulnerable than any that we've seen in the past. I think it was Jen Easterly said in an interview a week or two back that a lot of the technologies that we rely on are fundamentally, have these fundamental security challenges, and that we, our underlying tech ecosystem is something that has a lot of gaps in it. So that's really, I think, the part where we see the entire internet ecosystem as needing to come together to further protect that.
So you mentioned ChatGPT. Of course, we can't not talk about it because everybody's talking about it. What's your take on it? What do you think in terms of security challenges that it poses, both, short term and long term, and especially for, our audience of financial services, what do you think CISOs need to be aware of, like, right now?
Yeah, well, first I would encourage anyone who hasn't done so to play around with it. It's truly impressive when you ask it just open-ended questions like, how would you build a security strategy, and what does it look like, and what are the top threats? And it certainly doesn't hit the mark every time, but there's there's a lot to be gained by just kind of hands-on playing around with the tool and seeing what it has to offer. I think that the biggest short-term threat that we face through these kind of tools is the fact that they're very widely accessible. Yeah, they're accessible to threat actors. We've seen that threat actors are very quick to monetize and find ways to apply new technology. So when a new technology comes out, their innovation cycle is very, very rapid. And in many ways, a lot of what AI does subverts kind of long-standing practices that we have within the security community. So if you think, for example, about the phishing training that we give, and like, here are some of the ways that you can spot a legitimate email from a phish. So we know that, let's say if that advice 5 or 10 years ago was like, well, you're going to see a lot of spelling mistakes and grammatical errors and things that just don't make sense. We know that that's gotten more sophisticated even in recent years. But I think what we're not ready for is just the extent to which AI tooling will be able to really emulate a person and make it such that that training doesn't really help anymore, right? Because it's just not going to be feasible for a person to be able to reasonably distinguish between what is a phish and what is a legitimate email. And I think we're just at the early days now of kind of what's going to be possible. So we're going to need to catch up as a security community. I'm worried about that gap period because, like I said, the innovation coming from the attacker side tends to historically happen a lot more rapidly than our ability to adjust ourselves and more than anything, just our mind frame and how we think about these kind of things. So in the short term, I think there's certainly a concern there. More in the medium and long term, I think there's an incredible amount of opportunities that these tools offer the security community in terms of how we're able to identify threats and how we're able to enable defenders to networks. And, of course, a lot of security tooling already integrates some level of AI. But I think we're at early days of really leveraging that potential in terms of automating a lot of what we do and being able to take a lot of the work that security teams do today, which is still very kind of manual and people focused, and allowing us to automate that so that we can kind of move our people further up the value chain and have them do other kind of work. So incredibly interesting times that we're entering with this tooling. And again, I would, going back to one of your earlier questions around the kind of skill sets that people can have, I think it's just fundamental for anyone who's in security today to understand how AI can be applied to the role that they do today, how they can best leverage those tools.
Let's talk about something that, we've been working on together, which is the evolution of DDoS. In my mind, it was long considered kind of a nuisance, like a low-level problem, but not really a serious threat. But that seems to be changing. Can you talk a little bit about why?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think DDoS was looked at as this boring kind of thing and kind of just part of the plumbing that you have in place and almost a little bit of a solved problem type of thing and not something that we had to worry about. And it has certainly resurfaced. We've seen, massive DDoS attacks at scale. We've also seen the phenomena where it's hard for, it's really hard to have a site that's up without adequate DDoS protection for any period of time. So it's become, a little bit of a table stakes to have that kind of protection. I think part of what has changed is that, firstly, it's become easier to commandeer a army of bots and to conduct a DDoS attack. So we've seen that capability become commoditized in some way, and there's a pretty sophisticated kind of marketplace out there for folks who want to either rent those kind of capabilities or acquire those kind of capabilities, and that's available fairly broadly to a broad set of threat actors. The other thing, and this touches back on something that we're talking about earlier, is that there are a lot of these critical systems that, if they're not available for some period of time, can really have a huge impact. And one of the things that we've seen is that there's almost more impact and concern now around availability versus confidentiality of data. So we've seen so many, ransomware attacks where data has been spilled out there, and there's just been a lot of these data dumps that people have become a little bit desensitized to it. But when critical systems are, just purely unavailable, like we were talking about airline systems, right? If your flight is canceled, or if hospitals are unable to do what they need to do, and or if an e-commerce site is unavailable, that's something very tangible that both end users feel, as well as, of course, hitting the bottom line in the cases of enterprises. And as we get into a ever more complex kind of software ecosystem, where the number of dependencies that a company has on these various sites being up, you could literally have hundreds of different systems that have to be operational at any given time in order for your company to be able to conduct business. So you really get sort of a bit of a soft underbelly there in terms of your risk of DDoS. So I don't think this problem is going to be going away. There's also we've seen the threat of DDoS evolve in different directions, where it can really attack different layers of the stack. So anywhere from your network layer to your application layer. So there's a lot more that folks have to think about in terms of how they're protecting themselves. And I think that this is going to be something that is going to continue to be definitely a source of risk in the coming years.
Teresa, who's our global head of intelligence, was mentioning to me that even 10 years ago, threat actors were using DDoS essentially as a decoy to distract everybody and then go in and, drop some malware or exfiltrate some data or whatever other kinds of attacks they were doing. Do you see that also as a part of this threat, where it's basically a diversion and a problematic diversion, but then that means that other stuff is going on, so that security teams need to be essentially doubly on notice when it happens?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, something, a phenomena that we've observed in the past, and security teams, have finite resources, of course. And so there's always going to be the risk of that kind of diversion when you have, one type of attack and then it's coupled with another kind of attack. But I think we also see, DDoS attacks as an end, unto themselves, especially when they're able to be carried out successfully. And one of the challenges for, one of the ongoing challenges for security teams is that they need to constantly get it right? With DDoS, for example, threat actor can just continue to try, and there's no skin off their back, so to speak, if it fails a whole bunch of times, and they just have to succeed that one time. And they haven't really burned their techniques in the same way as, for example, if you try to use a 0-day and if you're caught, and maybe that kind of burns that particular method. So I think that there are advantages from an attacker perspective to leveraging that attack format. Again, particularly for organizations that are very sensitive to uptime, right? Which today it's certainly not all organizations, but a lot of organizations fit into that bucket.
One thing that we've been hearing a lot more about is the convergence of cyber and fraud, which seems obvious at some level, but organizationally, it's often very separate. Certainly in the financial sector, there's whole fraud departments that have nothing to do with cyber. Do you see that changing from your vantage point? Do you see that there's this convergence going on and that there's going to have to be some organizational change in order to effectively deal with the skyrocketing, especially with ChatGPT and deep fakes and all these other highly sophisticated technological tools that threat actors now have at their disposal?
Yeah, absolutely. Fraud in many ways has become a deeply technical issue. I think of fraud as a continuum, and the term is sometimes used differently in different organizations. On the one end of the continuum, there is some part of fraud that is really just unwanted business. So you could look at a customer who doesn't pay regularly, or has missed payments, and they may be a fraudulent customer. They may just be a customer who who doesn't have good credit or whatnot. And so different organizations kind of approach that in different ways. I think there's always going to be a part of fraud which is on that one end of the continuum that falls more under kind of unwanted business, which is going to be part which is best located organizationally within the business itself, because they have that view into what is the business logic and what, their customer profiles, et cetera. But there certainly is, in terms of fraud being a way of nefariously getting access to goods and services that you haven't paid for, and using various, increasingly technical means to try to achieve that. I think that you're seeing that increasingly within security teams. So questions of, for example, how do you ensure that accounts are properly protected and validated, right? And that you're protecting against things like bots and so forth. Those are things that security teams have the visibility into. So you need to certainly ensure that there's a very deep partnership between your security team and the teams that are looking to protect against that. But you're absolutely right that there's historically been in many organizations silos with that, particularly in the financial industry. And I think that the organizations that are successfully addressing this problem have a partnership between their security teams and their business teams. And it comes back to this question of data and ensuring that you have, the data available, you're able to make the right decisions at the right time. And of course, one really critical element here is you want to make sure that you're facilitating your legitimate customers, and you're not putting roadblocks in front of them, or you're not creating a customer experience which is negative for them. So again, that requires a deep partnership between your security teams and your business teams.
Do you see new ways that firms are being able to do that? I mean, I had a conversation with my mother who was like, yeah, I'm not doing multi-factor authentication. And I was like, well, would you rather the extra step, or would you rather your bank account be drained? And she was like, oh, I guess, but she's still not doing it. Right. So, I mean, to me, that was a kind of bellwether of the general sentiment. Whereas, for people who are involved in cybersecurity, it's like a no-brainer. But generally, do you see that that's truly a roadblock to, these sort of basic steps of like multi-factor authentication and stuff like that? Are there better ways or newer ways that firms are going to be able to have at their disposal to ensure that that friction is minimized, and therefore better security, that consumers take better security into their own hands?
So, I think there's certainly, there's certainly going to be some steps that consumers need to take. You gave the example of multi-factor authentication, and there is a process there. And I think we've all, faced it as we talk to different people in our orbit who, don't necessarily want to do things like multi-factor and so forth. But I think there's a general acceptance that you have to go through some additional hoops, or you may need to, enter in a two-factor code or whatnot. But I think what's important is that we're not shifting the responsibility onto the end user in unreasonable ways. So, for example, we've all been in those cases where you need to click on all sorts of unreasonable CAPTCHAs, and then you're taken through to a page where you have to answer all sorts of historical information that may or may not be accurate. And then at the end of that entire process, you still haven't been authenticated, and you're kind of scratching your head and you're wondering, like, kind of what more could I do as an end user? And so I think the part around the end user experience is really critical. And I think that most end users are willing to take a small level of inconvenience in order to protect themselves, as long as it's kind of reasonable and it's transparent to them. But there is a lot, to your point, that can be done on the back end in terms of just looking at, where are the connections coming from, right? Does this user interaction look like previous interaction from this user? And there's a lot of technologies that have come out, and certainly a lot of the members within FS-ISAC and within the financial community in general leverage those kind of toolings. But it is a continuous tuning game, because as those things become more obvious, attackers adapt their own techniques. So if you think of things like just what country is somebody connecting from, and there's different tooling that can allow you to block certain things there. But attackers have become more sophisticated in their techniques. So today, the more advanced systems will look and really try to profile what does this individual generally look like when they're connecting. And this ties back to our point around AI and the ability to leverage those those capabilities from a defensive perspective. There's a lot that we can do. When you think about the typical user actually tends to follow a lot of patterns that are very, very similar. And so when you build that profile over time, if all of a sudden something comes out that's just where there's something a little bit out of left field, you have the ability to say, hey, this doesn't really look like the real user. Either we block them entirely, or maybe we just sort of raise an extra, we just raise a threshold a little bit in terms of what we expect that person to do to authenticate. So I think there's been a lot of great improvements in that space, and we're, the challenge of things like account takeover and just fraudulent use of accounts is one where there's a lot of tools at our disposal these days, but it's by no means a completed, a done deal. There's still a lot of work to do.
So everybody's talking about a recession over the next year and a half. Does that change the calculus at all for what CISOs need to be thinking about, what their priorities should be? Are there things that they should absolutely ensure that are untouched no matter what budget cuts come down the pike?
Yeah, so there's no question that we are in a more complex macroeconomic environment today than we have been in the past. That's just a reality, and a lot of firms, even within the security industry, are struggling, and that's I think a time that poses both kind of challenges and opportunities for security teams. I think one of the things that we tend to see is fairly well protected are direct security budgets over time. So I think organizations realize that there's a lot of threats out there, and their core security investments are things that even in more difficult macroeconomic times, need to be protected. I think one of the big challenges for security teams is that a lot of the work that we do is dependent on other parts of the organization, right? And those parts of the organization come under a lot of stress during these kind of times. So I think from a priority perspective, it's important to make sure that the basics, the core security hygiene in terms of issues like, what are our core assets inventory? Do we have the base levels of controls around them? Are we able to, ensure that when something happens, we have the right detective and reactive controls, ensuring that those things are in place, ensuring that our partners across the organization are aligned with, the parts of our security roadmaps that they need to execute on. So certainly it's an area that requires extra attention and planning. I think that there are some more discretionary projects which maybe come under pressure in these kind of times, and those kind of realignments are things that CISOs should be looking at. So, for example, if there's projects that one's doing that are more researchy in nature, or projects that are more based around, giving certain tooling that is more exploratory, I do see some organizations where that's coming under pressure in this kind of environment. And again, I think it's important for folks in this type of environment to focus on the basics, the core protections, the hygiene and the plumbing, and make sure that that's not being affected within this current climate.
Just occurs to me, and you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but do you see quantum computing as a core basic at this point, or is it still something that's preparing for a post-quantum cryptographic world? Is that something that's can wait, or is it something that is a core need that we have to just address now, even though it feels like it's far away?
I think it's one of these things that feels like it's far away until it isn't. So it's kind of like a Y2K thing, but where you don't know what the 2K is. But it's probably it's certainly not a 2100 thing. To stick with the date metaphor, it's something that's going to be happening and going to be real at some point in the not super distant future. Now, that said, I think it's something that for most organizations is important to keep track of, but isn't something that they necessarily need to take action on today. That said, there's certainly industries where their threat profile is such that, for example, if you're in an area where the risk that somebody is taking encrypted data today and is just kind of storing it and is going to hold on to it for a post-quantum day, and then that data will still have value at that point, then that kind of organization, may need to take different steps. But I think by and large, and I think this is true of most financial firms as well, certainly something to keep a close eye on. When you look, for example, at the different algorithms that are being put forward that are quantum resistant, I think it's the kind of thing where you don't want to be the first one on the block to adopt it, but you certainly don't want to be the last one. There are, when you look at the risks that quantum computing will pose to established algorithms today and the established public key encryption. It's the kind of thing where initially I think there's going to be theoretical publications and there's things that have already come out, but the more pragmatic risks are probably outweigh those. And some of the alternatives, the quantum proof alternatives that are being put forth and that are going to be developed are things that haven't really been tested by the security community all that much. So they're not really kind of battle proven. And so there may be greater risk in just, swapping everything out for these post-quantum methods. So, my recommendation would be to follow it closely, and as things kind of mature to the point where the security community has a consensus and has really looked and tested things, that's the time to start, to go forward with implementation plans. But certainly a really fascinating area. It's close to my heart because I started out as in cryptography and have always been, fascinated by that particular area. And I think that the developments there certainly within 5 to 10 years are going to be things that we can't even really predict today.
Yeah. Okay. Any other topics that you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered a great, a great deal of topics across the board. I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about in terms of career development for folks or advice for folks who are kind of entering the field or anything like that. I'm happy to dive into any of this.
Let's do that too. We can do that too. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who A, wants to be a CISO, like is a mid-level person who wants to be a CISO, and B, to new people who are entering the field, just now for the first time?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the second part. If you're entering the field, if you're looking to get into security, one of the great things about security is that it is such an open field. The information is out there online. There's so much that you can start playing with and tinkering with. And, I really encourage people to follow their kind of their passion in terms of what they're interested in the field. There's so many different aspects to security, whether it's security operations or security architecture, compliance, penetration testing. It's a very, very broad field. And if there's one of those particular areas that speak to you, I'd encourage you to just really deep dive, build up some technical skills. Technical skills doesn't necessarily need to be pure engineering, but it's just understanding how to pull things apart and how things work and kind of diving into the details, and just build up an area that you feel that you're expert in and that you can speak to. One of the things that when I'm interviewing folks or talking to folks that I find is most highly correlates with success is people who've just started out some sort of project. They have something they've thrown up on GitHub, or they've just built up their own environment at home and they've started tinkering around with things. So, that would really be my, one of the core areas. Finding a mentor is really key as well. Find someone who's been in the field for a while, who's, able to kind of share with you career advice and point you in the right direction and connect you with folks. And in terms of folks who are mid-level and looking to become CISOs, I personally find it an extremely, satisfying and fulfilling area to be in. I always encourage folks to look at, what are the areas that they're good in today, and what are some of the gaps that they feel that they need to fill in. So, for example, if somebody feels like they're not completely comfortable speaking through an overall strategy, or if somebody feels like budgeting isn't their strong point, or if somebody feels that the technical or underpinnings of their business or something where they need to brush up on, I'd encourage them to sort of identify the areas that they see as their biggest gaps and to just dive headfirst into that. Seek out opportunities, in your current role where you can kind of connect to that. And then for folks who are looking at where they'd want to do that kind of opportunity, I think that there's, different industries have different profiles of what CISOs do. And it's really important to find an organization that really values security and that sort of has the right kind of culture and has the right integration of security into the organization. So I would also just encourage people to be thoughtful and deliberate about the kind of organization where they want to bring their skills to bear.
Thanks so much, Boaz. It was great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks to Boaz for being our guest on this episode. Based on our conversation, I'll leave you with a quote on AI from B.F. Skinner. The real problem is not whether machines think, but whether men do. If you like this podcast and want to hear more from FinCyber leaders around the world, subscribe to FinCyber today on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also find them, as well as articles by other thought leaders, at fsisac.com/insights, and also follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something.